So there is a very broad spectrum of especially saturated fatty acids. We, of course, are always heavy on the long chain. That's what's very abundant in nature. We also have medium chain in nature that can be moderately abundant, but generally then that's more coconut oil, so a fruit fat, which I defend wholeheartedly. My view on fats is get them from animal and fruit sources in particular. So I've made some discussions in the past about, all right, you know what, eat the kind of rainbow of fats. People talk about eating the rainbow of fruits and vegetables. We can all laugh at that silliness. And I just sort of, in a few venues, have hijacked that expression to say, eat the rainbow of fats. Now, someone would say, so there's no question that short chain fatty acids do have pronounced metabolic effects in the body. This has been well documented, even in humans. Giving a human like vinegar, for example, which is a short chain fat, has a substantial ability to reduce glucose and insulin effects. Now, this is a unique audience of people that are pretty diligent with what they eat, I think, for the most part, or at least the curious who are attempting to be diligent, perhaps. It's easy to get the long chain fats, and someone would say, well, if I'm adhering strictly to a low carnivore diet, I'm not going to get the short chain. My response would be, well, you don't need them. These are not essential fatty acids. And moreover, the degree to which the intestines, even on a carnivore diet, may be making short chain fats on their own, which they can do, that's probably happening anyway. So I would just want anyone to know, if they're worried and thinking, oh, I got to get this full spectrum of fats that Ben mentioned, you don't actually. The short chain fats or the medium chain fats, despite having very real metabolic benefits, I would say, they are not essential. I would submit that those metabolic benefits are less relevant the more tightly controlled someone's diet is. In other words, if this were a person eating a conventional cruddy diet, then I would say you can move the needle by focusing on some medium and short chain fats. But the more you have your diet dialed in, then the less relevant those would become. And so that's why you can take someone who's been on the Western diet, and that is a better term, or just the global diet, maybe is the best term. You can put them even on something as horrifically unsustainable as a vegan diet, and they'll be a little better, at least for a time. And so when you look at these studies that have looked at plant-based, low-fat diets, it's no wonder they have some improvement, because like you said, do anything and it's going to be better. But then let's just see what happens over the long run and force someone into a low-fat, low-calorie state. Hunger always wins. If that's your dietary strategy, to cut your fat and cut your calories, hunger always wins. And so that's my view, that if someone's dietary strategy is focused on energy, and I know that's becoming increasingly popular, you just got to cut down your energy, which is just a sexy way of saying low calorie, hunger always wins. And so don't let that be your primary strategy if someone wants to control body weight. Let the strategy be, I would say, keep your insulin in control, or an alternative view would be focus on what's essential, these essential fats and proteins, and cut the unessential, namely carbohydrates. That's going to be a more sustainable approach. And then the energy will take care of itself. If that puts you into an energy deficit, so be it. But you're not in an energy deficit because you explicitly attempted to start with that. If you do, hunger always wins. Dairy is the perfect food for growth. And that's why mama mammal makes it for baby mammal. It really is unique. To my knowledge, and I bet this is an informed enough group that I could be corrected if I'm wrong. I think that milk, which is the purest form of dairy, I think it is the only food that is high in all three macronutrients. And so it's sort of roughly kind of across the board. And I think that's kind of a fascinating situation where the body is designed to have this perfect cocktail to fuel the growth of this little baby as rapidly as possible. I think it's quite beautiful and fascinating. I'm a grown human. I'm done. So I personally don't drink milk, but not for any other reason, really. I just think, all right, that's got a decent amount of sugar. I don't need that. I don't need to grow in that regard. And all three macros are certainly a good recipe for growth. I'm very favorable to my kids drinking whole milk. I am personally more interested in fermented dairy, where the bacteria have done their magic. And bacteria like cancer cells, love sugar. They love glucose. You cannot get a bacteria or a human tumor. In fact, despite the debates, it's never human tumors to use anything but glucose. So I will then I love cheese, although I find like a little goes a long way. I have to moderate how much I eat. And actually that's about the end of it for me. But we have dairy in the home. Now, your question though, dairy and insulin resistance. No, there is in fact evidence in humans to show that whole milk adults are metabolically healthier than those who are drinking skim milk, at least. So that's sort of a milk to milk comparison. But in general, I think someone could overdo it on milk. You could certainly overdo it on yogurt because a little thing of yogurt has as much sugar as a pint of Ben & Jerry's does.
Typical flavored yogurts are low fat and high sugar. Some have as much as 30 grams of carbs. There are some great exceptions. For example, Siggy's Triple Cream and Icelandic Scar. They have as few as 6 grams of carbs.
In nature, protein always comes with fat. If someone is looking at a protein that doesn't have fat, one, we've either stripped it, we've robbed it of the fat, like with whey supplements, or two, like a plant protein that doesn't have fat. Well, it was never really a protein in the first place. If you're getting now I know this is the right audience to say that to, but plants don't give protein. It's animals that give protein, and those are the best by any possible metric for humans. And protein always comes with fat. Not only does the fat help you digest it better, Sean, this is one of the more fascinating discoveries I'd made looking at digestion. It is that bile acids actually facilitate the proteolytic enzymes in the intestines. And we look at bile acids as strictly being relevant to fat digestion, but they have this dual role at facilitating protein digestion. I think that's why so commonly people will take a protein shake and they'll say, oh, I can't have whey because whey upsets my stomach. And I'll always tell them, well, what happens if you eat the whey with fat? Like God intended, perhaps. Then they suddenly don't have those issues so commonly. So whether it's just the digestive benefit or not, the fact is clear. Protein alone has an anabolic effect. Protein and fat has an additive anabolic effect, but you don't get that when you have protein and carb. There's a study done looking at protein with maltodextrin, and there was no further muscle protein synthesis when the maltodextrin was added than the protein alone. And once again, we're left saying, well, that makes some sense because in nature, the best proteins don't come with carbs. They only come with fat. So I believe that there are 3 primary causes of insulin resistance. And when I say primary, I am using that term to say that there is evidence in cell culture, so isolated cells, which is very artificial, of course, but even still useful, and rodent models and humans. So in all 3 of these biomedical models, there are 3 noxious stimuli that have been shown to cause insulin resistance. One is elevated insulin itself that I already elaborated on. 2 is inflammation. You can take inflammatory cytokines and cause insulin resistance in cells, rodents, and humans. And 3rd, stress or cortisol in particular, but even epinephrine actually. So I'll just say stress. I'll go back to that more vague term. Again, in cells, rodents, and humans, in all 3 of those models, you can use insulin, stress, and inflammation to cause insulin resistance. So those to me are the 3 primary causes, each acting on their own. So as much as I'm an advocate of insulin, and I am just because that's the one I believe you can control the lever most readily, inflammation is a cause. You just can't always control that so well depending on your overall health. And stress is a cause, which again is a lever that you might only have a weak grasp on because it's hard to control that. Now, I think polyunsaturated fats like linoleic acid, I would call that one in particular a secondary cause. If you are eating lots of linoleic acid, it will readily accumulate in fat cells. That does happen. And it is readily metabolized into molecules that force a fat cell to grow through hypertrophy rather than hyperplasia. And that touches on something we mentioned early in this conversation, that if a fat cell is growing through hypertrophy, it will become insulin resistant rather than hyperplasia. And these linoleic acid metabolites actually tip the fat cell more towards hypertrophy. But even then, it's not making the fat cell grow in and of itself. I would say if you have high linoleic acid and enough insulin to stimulate the growth or the retention of fat and fat cells, now you have a perfect storm. And I think that matters because that is where we are at this day and age, with high linoleic acid, high PUFA, and high insulin stimulation.
Q&A. What is the difference in fat cell hypertrophy and hyperplasia? Hypertrophy is an increase in the size of cells. Hyperplasia is an increase in the number of cells. Hypertrophy can lead to weight gain and insulin resistance and its problems. Hyperplasia can mean weight gain without insulin resistance.
You need carnitine in order to burn fats, right? And Sean, I know you know this. So carnitine acts as a shuttle for moving the fats from the cytosol, so the moving a fat into the mitochondria. So it's one thing to get the fat into the cell, and then it's another to get it into the mitochondria, which has its own wall or membrane. So you literally couldn't burn fat if you didn't have enough carnitine. And Sean, you're absolutely right. We make it, and so it's not essential. However, there have been clinical cases of carnitine deficiency, and I believe it was because people were vegetarian. So there's a little part of me that thinks we could probably get to a point of carnitine deficiency if we were in like someone who is adhering to a plant-based ketogenic diet. I would say that's a perfect person who's going to become carnitine deficient. Because if you're ketogenic, that means you're burning fat like gangbusters. That's how it's ketogenic, because the ketones are derived from the fat burning. And if you're plant-based, of course, you're not eating any carnitine. So you're relying 100% on your own carnitine production. So if someone is, and I know this happens, there are people who attempt to do this, bless their degenerating brains in that case. But if you are a plant-based ketogenic person, you probably are going to become carnitine deficient, or I wouldn't be surprised if you could, and then you'd better be supplementing on it somehow. But of course, anyone who's eating some steak, they're getting all they need. If they need any extra beyond what they're already making, you've got all the building blocks to make as much as you need.
Myself personally, I'm somewhere in about 30% of my calories come from protein, typically maybe 40 on some days, depending if I've got ribeyes versus some other type of steak. And I think that seems to be a nice spot.
I actually agree wholeheartedly. That kind of macro range that you outlined is one I agree with completely, where I think, to me, ideally, protein is going to be somewhere, but again, I hate giving it a caloric value because I think that's just silly, but it should be anywhere from that 30 to 40% range. And interestingly, if fat is largely taking up the rest of that, so it's either 70-30 or 60-40, that's roughly in the range of a 1-to-1 by mass, maybe slightly a little more protein to fat by mass. And that's what we see in an egg. An egg is roughly 1-to-1 by mass. And I joke that it's sort of God's perfectly packaged food. Not that someone has to eat an egg, of course, but I do think in nature, we still see this kind of 1-to-1 ratio of fat to meat by mass kind of coming out very frequently in these very nutritious sources of protein. I consider my role as father and husband, of course, to be the absolute most important thing I'll ever do in my life. I am exquisitely mindful of what we're feeding them. And really, to me, I do prioritize protein. I want them to eat protein, and I know there's going to be some good fat that comes with it. I don't prioritize the fat. I prioritize the protein, in part because doing so helps us focus on real food, because that is what's so deficient in artificial foods. You've always stripped out the protein. You've kept fats, you've added carbs, but you've deprived it of the protein. And so focusing on protein for my kids is absolutely a priority. And that's why whenever I do any like breakfasts, when I make breakfast, which I do every morning, literally every morning for the kids, it's always really heavy with eggs. I've just found, not that I don't give them carbs. Even this morning it was pancakes, even with syrup on it. I didn't eat it. But these are my little growing kids, and I don't care if they have some flour, but I make it so that each little pancake they eat has 1 to 2 eggs in it. And I'm lathering the butter, and I'm just thinking, good, they're getting some eggs. They're getting good protein, but they don't get that at their school lunch. Sean, I think, I know you and I, despite having never talked politics, agree probably on all of it. I think that the more I think, to my knowledge, the US government in the 1970s, I think that was the first time in the history of the world that a government told its people what to eat. And there may be an exception. I'm not a historian at all. And look at how well that worked.
In these charts, we can see that in the 1970s, when the government nutritional guidelines were implemented, obesity began to rise, not only in the United States, but eventually across the developed world.
I'm not opposed to carb cycling on a low carb diet. And in fact, I'm often quick to say that's in practice kind of how I live my life. I am in fact quite low carb and even quite carnivore, but not 100%. And I've just found in my family dynamic, although my wife is very supportive, she doesn't try to challenge these ideas much. It's just in my family dynamic with my wife and kids, I just end up eating carbs to some degree. I don't know what, a few times a week in some larger amount. And so I end up carb cycling just almost for practical reasons, but not deliberate. My view is I know of no reason to deliberately carb cycle. Someone would say, well, then I want to maintain that high degree of metabolic flexibility. I want to be able to shift between the two, because I do think there's this thing that I call reverse metabolic flexibility with long-term ketogenic adherence, where people call it physiological insulin resistance. And that is just not true. That is not an accurate term, because if you give someone who's a ketogenic diet, a carnivore diet, give them a load of insulin and you watch their glucose plummet, that is not insulin resistance. They're very insulin sensitive, but they've become glucose intolerant. And so if you have someone who's adhered to, say, a carnivore diet, then they load themselves up with 2 bowls of mini wheats, like I did one time, because I kind of cracked and I'm addicted to cold cereal, so I can't have it in the house. My glucose was up for like 18 hours after that. And someone would say, it's because your low carb diet made you insulin resistant. That is just not true. I'd become glucose intolerant. And why not? What happens with long-term carnivore or ketogenic diet adherence is that the body, the beta cells, one, have a lower load of insulin preformed, because the beta cells always have a certain amount of insulin they've made and they're just holding on to. And they've downgraded, they've reduced the expression of some of these proteins involved in insulin production. And why not? Why wouldn't they? Because you need so little, and the body is too efficient to hold on to all this machinery, let alone the already packaged product, when the demand for it is simply so low. The beta cell is too smart for that. And so some people, back to my point, people will say, you got a carb cycle to keep that insulin and glucose tolerant. And I say, well, only if you want to stay glucose tolerant. But if you're just saying, I'm just going to go low carb and this is the end of it, well, then there's no reason to carb cycle in my mind. Yeah, Sean, it really is something, isn't it? That evidence that obesity was, I would say, the single most relevant risk factor, that came out so early in the midst of this. And the evidence just continues to stack up. And then it was discovering more and more that the co-receptor, or the way that the virus gets inside cells, is that the fat cells are among the highest expressors of this co-receptor, making the fat cell such an ideal home for the virus replicating. And then even the people that are truly dying from COVID and not some other cause, often the problem is blood clots. And it's so interesting that the fat cell is the most common source of the expression of a protein called plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, or PAI1. And that promotes clot formation. So once again, the fat cell becomes relevant. And we know that people that are overweight or obese are shedding the virus for significantly longer, so are theoretically more infectious significantly longer than someone who has lower fat or is lean. Yeah, I do think it is a shockingly naive view to not think that this virus is here to stay. It is. Like every virus that is flu-like, we will never eradicate it. It will mutate, it will change. Generally, that means it becomes both less lethal, yet more infectious. It moves better, but doesn't do as much damage. That's good news in my view. We will never. This virus is now a permanent part of the global ecosystem, and sure, vaccines appear to be remarkably effective. And my view personally is that I'll get it when I feel like I have to, which I rage against. I'm enough of a libertarian, although more just traditionally conservative, but I'm enough of a libertarian to rage against the idea that I have to get someone's approval with a COVID vaccine or vaccine passport, whatever. But nevertheless, I think the vaccines appear to be remarkably effective, but the virus will mutate. And where does it end? It would now just become like a flu and the flu vaccine, where any year you go in and get the vaccine and you just hope that's the particular strain of virus you get exposed to that particular flu season. Now, I don't mean to, I'd hate for anyone listening to think that I'm talking too lightly. Let me be clear. I do believe that this virus is real and that it really does have a lethal potential to it. So I really do feel that way. But the evidence is so clear that if you're metabolically healthy, it's likely that this will do very little to you. And so my view is, as much as a vaccine can be a wonderful discovery, as seems to happen so often, the more clever we get in finding these complicated, technologically advanced solutions to problems, the more we are inclined to overlook and even forget the more base solution, which is just control your own, put your own house in order. And that if you can control your own metabolic health when you are exposed, because it is inevitable you will be, it's going to be significantly less relevant than it would be otherwise.